All right, folks, Professor Garrett here. As promised, this is our CAP review video, and I want to use this time to make sure that you guys are getting an explanation for the answers. Of course, that's important for this course, but also to be able to take the information and apply it through the rest of the course into KIN274, and guess what? In the rest of the program. As we talked about before, these concepts are foundational to the field of kinesiology. Whether you go into strength conditioning, personal training, athletic training, physical therapy, regardless, the field of kinesiology, as we all know, is relatable or relates to the study of the human body and human movement. So these are things that we need to understand, and so I want to make sure that we spend some time here. Hopefully the video stays within about 10 minutes, but I'm asking you guys all to hold on here because hopefully you're able to grab a nugget of knowledge that you otherwise didn't know. I also want to be upfront with you guys. These are concepts that I struggled with quite a bit when I was going through my bachelor's program, and surprisingly even in my master's program. And one of the things that helped the most was making sure that I was applying the information that I was learning. Meaning, when I would go into the weight room, I would begin to, in my mind, try to talk about what I'm doing, what plane of motion am I working through, what joint action is taking place, what muscles are involved here. So we have a twofold benefit. Not only are we getting in our physical activity, which we all should be doing, one as practitioners of kinesiology, but also just as humans we need to be moving. We were created to move. We were not created to sit in chairs and couches. As comfortable as that is at times, we were made to move, folks. And so we get some exercise out of this. And then number two, we're getting repetitive practice. And we're getting applicable practice because we're doing it, thinking about it while we're executing the exercises. So let's go ahead and get into this. Number one, I'm going to go through each of the questions, and I'm going to discuss perhaps some strategies in taking these and also giving you guys little pieces that you need to make sure that you take away from the assignment, really. So first, use the picture below to answer questions 1 through 3. The pitcher's left foot is blank to his head. So the first thing here is we need to look at what's going on, right? His left foot is here, and it's quite a bit above his head, right? I think we can all agree there. So what we then need to do is look at the terms provided, and we need to know these. So what does inferior mean? What is superior? What is posterior? And what is dorsal? So inferior is below, and the way that I think of this is, not that this is a good thing, but if someone is inferior to you, they are below you, okay? And so you're going to need to start to find ways to connect some of these words with perhaps other things, not only in the field of kinesiology, which is why it's so important to be diverse in what you do, instead of staying with blinders on and only think in one field. So for me, I think of if someone is inferior, they are lower than, less than, below, and so that's my cue to kind of remember what inferior means, okay? Superior, I have superiors, and I am inferior to my superiors. This would be my department chair, the program director, deans, so on and so forth. And you have that at your jobs. There's typically some type of structural component there. So inferior is below, superior is above, posterior is post, it's behind. This happened back behind me, or I don't know. You guys can kind of come up with some of these, but think of posterior, or the actual definition is going to be our backside. But something that happened in post was before, right? And then dorsal is also referring to the back or the posterior. So of these four terms, we have inferior below, we have superior above, we have posterior and dorsal, which are generally behind, okay? So the left foot, it's not below the head, right? We can agree that the left foot is above it. We also can agree that the left foot is in front of the body, so it's not behind the body, which leaves us to the foot being superior, okay? Question 2, both of the pitcher's knees are in flexion, extension, internal or external rotation. So both of the knees, I think we all can agree have some type of bend in them. So extension is when something is extending or being straightened out. Flexing something is bending, right? We flex a bar or flex this pen, right? There's some flex in the pen, so it's bending. We have internal rotation, which is where something is rotating in. So for example, at the knee, let's see if I can get this in film here. If I was internally rotating, my knee would be coming in. If I was externally rotating, my knee would be out. But what we see here is that both of the knees, and you can argue, perhaps you can argue for some rotation. I don't see it, but what I do know that both of the knees are doing is they surely are flexing here, okay? And then number 3, the pitcher's right ankle is exhibiting plantar flexion, abduction, dorsiflexion, or adduction. Remember that the ankles don't abduct and adduct, they invert and evert, okay? So these are both terms that we can kind of throw out because we don't use them at the ankle generally. And then the ankles do, however, plantar flex and dorsiflex. So when my ankle is up or my ankle is at 90 degrees, we're in dorsiflexion. When we point our toe, we now go into plantar flexion. So I think of dorsiflexion as being the dorsal fin of a shark or a dolphin or something, a fish, something out of water. And so I think of the dorsal fin being kind of straight up and looking almost like a 90-degree angle. Whereas plants go into the ground, and if I point my toe, then I'm pointing it into the ground and I'm growing and I'm kind of extending my ankle here. Again, these are just ways that I remember it. You guys can come up with much more creative and or ways that you guys will be able to remember. But with that being said, is the ankle flexing here or is it pointing? Well, the right ankle is in fact flexing, so we would call this dorsiflexion. All right. Question 4. The athlete below is pressing the dumbbells blank from the chest upwards. This action represents a blank contraction of the prime movers. So we're going from this position to this position. Now remember, we already talked about superior, which means above, and inferior, which is below. Well, he's not doing that. He's pressing in front of him. So we have anterior and posterior. Remember, anterior is in front, posterior is behind. So if he's pressing something in front of him, that would be anterior. Don't get this confused with superior, which would be overhead or below. Okay? So just by reading the first answer here, we can tease out which answer is actually happening. So what we're doing here is pressing anteriorly in front. Remember, if we think about planes of motion, the frontal plane segments us into anterior and posterior halves. So I'm pressing towards the anterior aspect of my body. But we'll talk about planes of motion in a minute. Okay? So the answer here would be anteriorly, and it's a concentric contraction. This is the difficult part of the movement. It's easy to lower the dumbbells into the body. It's hard to press them up and away from the body. Next, question 5. The athlete below is exhibiting excessive lumbar lordosis, kyphosis, flexion, and inversion. So we usually don't use the term inversion at the spine, so we can kind of kick that one out. And again, this is just another instance where we need to know our terms. Generally, kyphosis is where we get a rounding, almost looking a rounding in the thoracic region. Similar to flexion, it's going to be kind of this hunched over position. Whereas lordosis, I think of it being lower. And so in the lower back, lordosis is when we see this scooping effect, which we can see right here in the lumbar region. So you could think of it two ways. Lordosis is low in the lumbar, and then kyphosis, again, we just need to know the opposite. If we know that these are the two common terms at the spine, if we know one, we can imply that the other is the opposite. I don't think that should be our default necessarily, but if we know one very well, then we can cancel it out or identify it as being the in fact answer, okay? So the answer here is lordosis because the lower back, the lumbar region is curling here, whereas kyphosis we would see a much larger round here at the top of the back. Okay, take a look at your text as well as images online, and you'll see there's a vast difference. Question 6, we're getting into the push-up and we're getting into planes of motion, which are my favorite because they're the most difficult to answer and the difficult to understand, and it makes it a little bit more challenging, as you guys, I'm sure, in this online platform. I'm not able to teach it and see your guys' face going, oh, okay, I get it, or what is he talking about? So I'm going to disclaim this now in saying that if you don't understand the process or the system that I'm suggesting here, please reach out. I've met with 2 or 3 students in the previous week, and I have 4 or 5 meetings with students this week. So feel free to reach out, folks. Do not be intimidated. I need you guys to understand these concepts because you're not going to want to get into your profession and not know these things, okay? So in the video above, the glenohumeral flexion and extension are occurring in the blank plane. So what we first need to understand and look at is what happens at the more mobile joint. And I've talked about this before, but in relation to the elbow, the shoulder is more mobile. And we're seeing, as the question dictates, flexion and extension, or flexion and extension at the shoulder, okay? So we first need to understand joint actions. If the more mobile joint is flexing and extending, which at the shoulder would be the more mobile joint, and the hip, these are essentially the same versions of each other. The shoulder is the upper body version, the hip is the lower body version. If the shoulder or hip flexes and extends, we are in the sagittal plane 9 times out of 10. I don't want to say that that's an absolute, but if the shoulder or the hip is flexing or extending, it's in the sagittal plane. And remember that this is flexion and extension, okay? If the shoulder or hip are abducting or adducting, then we're in the frontal plane. And if the shoulder is, or hip, internally or externally rotating, or horizontally abducting and horizontally adducting, then we are working through the transverse plane. So again, I need you guys to understand this. Flexion and extension at the shoulder and hip occur in the sagittal plane. Abduction and adduction at the hip and shoulder occur in the frontal plane. And internal, external rotation, as well as horizontal abduction and adduction at the shoulder or the hip occur in the transverse plane. If we understand that, it's going to unlock everything for us. So knowing that, if the glenohumeral joint, which is in here, where my humerus and my shoulder girdle essentially meet, if it's flexing and extending, and we know that flexion and extension at the shoulder or hip occurs in the sagittal plane, guess what? We're in the sagittal plane, okay? So moving on, and we're going to continue through planes of motion here. So we have a gentleman who is now performing the same exact movement, but what we're going to notice immediately before you even watch the video is where his hand placement are and where his elbows are. So with his hands being in, we're now internally rotating, and this is now forcing, my shoulder is now forcing my elbow out to the side, or excuse me, up at more of a 90-degree angle rather than keeping the elbows tucked in like the previous gentleman here, okay? So let's watch this movement real quick. So we're going down and up, down, up, down, up. Good. Okay, so what we're noticing here is that this person is, instead of their shoulder flexing and extending, they're now doing what? Moving through here. And we talked about this movement or joint action as horizontal abduction and adduction. And remember, where plane does horizontal adduction and abduction occur in if it's at the shoulder? That would be the transverse plane, because remember, we're working through here. So if we see the joint action and we know what our joint actions are, we know what flexion and extension, abduction and adduction look like at the most mobile joint, then we can determine if this person is moving here into horizontal adduction and abduction, then we already know what plane it's going to be in, right? So we first need to know the action. However, we see two options: horizontal adduction, abduction, horizontal adduction, abduction. Great. We know that it's going to be one of these two because the shoulder isn't flexing and extending anymore. And if we know where the joint actions take place, then we are going to be able to determine our plane of motion. Okay? Question 8. As the athlete descends eccentrically in the push-up, the scapula are protracting, depressing, adducting, or abducting. Right? Remember, adducting is bringing to the midline, abducting is moving away, depressing is kind of this downward rotation, and then protraction is going to be a rounding or also moving away from the midline of the body. So when the athlete descends eccentrically, what is happening? He's coming down, and so now the scapulas are coming together into retraction or adduction, okay? Because we're adding the scapulas to the midline of the body. Question 9, as the athlete completes the concentric phase, so now we're pushing up, the scapulas are doing the opposite. So they're no longer retracting or adducting, they're protracting, okay? So we know that we're going to be in these two answers here, and the action is controlled by what muscle? Remember that, especially from our muscle charts, that the rhomboids are posterior muscles. So if my shoulders are moving forward, my rhomboids are not going to be the muscle that helps produce this movement. So then we can deduce that it would be the serratus anterior. And then finally, we have an athlete completing a pull-up here. And this can be a tricky movement, but again, we need to look at the most mobile joint. If my arms are moving, are they abducting and adducting, which this gentleman's are, and you can see that based on where his elbow position is. If we're abducting and adducting, we know that we're in the frontal plane, okay? Now, if the elbows were in front, what's now the action at the shoulder? We have flexion and extension. So because of the fact that the elbows are now geared, or not geared, but they're pointing kind of down and out, this would be adduction of the humerus, okay? So as the athlete pulls himself up to the bar, the glenohumeral joint, what is the humerus doing? It's adducting to the body, which means that if we're adducting, then we're in the frontal plane, okay? Again, if you guys have questions about these things, please feel free to reach out. I need you guys to understand these concepts. I'm also going to be publishing a 6-step muscle formula video that is another system for looking at how we can begin to break down movement. But the most important things are to look at the movement in its entirety. What's happening here? Then we need to identify what joints are at play and what the actions are. And then we can start to look at the muscles. From there, we want to, after identifying which joints are at play, which one's the most mobile? Is it the shoulder, the elbow, the wrist, the hip, the knee, the ankle? We need to look at those because if the shoulder or the hip is involved, then we know that that's going to dictate the plane of motion for the less mobile joint. Now remember that there's a difference between mobility and range of motion, and what I'm talking about here is that mobility as in degrees of freedom, or I'm not saying that one joint has a better range of motion than the other, it's simply that it has more degrees of freedom. My shoulder can abduct, adduct, flex, extend, internal, external rotation, but my elbow just flexes and extends. It's a hinge joint. My knee just flexes and extends. It's a hinge joint. So the joint with more degrees of freedom, we want to look at that, okay? From there, and that would be considered our primary or maybe our most mobile joint. And then we want to identify as if it's compound or single joint. But if we know what joints are at play, the actions that are occurring, and the supporting muscles, as well as what the primary or most mobile joint is involved in the movement, we're going to be off to a great start. So again, I'm going to be creating a 6-step muscle formula as an additional resource for you guys. Please reach out with any questions. I hope you guys have a great week, and I'm looking forward to seeing you guys apply these concepts that we're discussing here. Have a great week, folks.